The second season of the Everything is a Primary Source podcast is nearing its end, this week in fact, but I'd like to use the final EPS podcast short slot to give a preview of the bonus episode that will be released in a few weeks. Award-winning author Laurie Halse Anderson's writing career boasts a litany of wonderful books, many of which are categorized as historical fiction. In this segment, and throughout this entire conversation, Laurie and I discuss the methods of locating primary sources and how to properly curate what is collected. Become a paid subscriber at epspodcast.substack.com or a patron at patreon.com/epspodcast to access the unedited audio and video early. Otherwise, continue to follow the show on social media, especially Instagram, for updates on the bonus episodes featuring Laurie Halse Anderson. I think I asked you this question years ago when it was either for Forge or Chains. I forget which one.
Okay.
But I think I asked you, when you are writing history fiction, do you let yourself get hung up on a primary source? Like if you are, all right, I need to base what I'm writing on fact. I need something from the time period to write about. Do you ever find yourself hitting a major obstacle by not finding the right thing that to write around?
Yeah, and people who write historical fiction for adults are lazy sons of guns, and they make up things often. Where those of us who care about kids and care about kids' understanding of history, we're held to an appropriately higher standard.
Yeah.
And the first example that jumps to mind is my book Chains, which is mostly set in New York City, the fall and winter of 76 into 77. And it's the story of a young woman held in slavery and her younger sister and a friend. And I had a really strong opening, and I'd done all of this research. And then I was pretty sure I knew how the book was going to end, but my middle was just so flat because I wasn't finding, this is when I was living in Oswego, right? So, and there wasn't, so I was researching this in, I think the book came out in 2006. So in the early aughts. So long before a lot of these, there was a lot of documentation that you could access online, and on Oswego's not so much the center of historical research in New York State.
Right.
And I didn't have a lot of money to travel to New York City very often. So I was like, so what I finally did is I gave myself a couple of weeks and I drove into Syracuse every day to the Byrd Library, which is the Syracuse University Library. Yeah. And I found the microfilms of the newspapers, and I just read the newspaper for every single day of my story.
Oh wow,
and
that's incredible.
Because there had to be something going on. I mean, I knew like that the British moved in, but none of the secondary sources at that time that I had read, that I had consulted to try to understand that world of New York City in 1776. None of them mentioned the ginormous fire that burned hundreds of homes that was probably set by the Patriots. And right smack in the middle of my book, it was, I leapt out of my chair and yelled in glee, which got me a lot of dirty looks, but there it was. Yeah. And so then I was able to find letters that people were writing out of the city to people in the city about their experience with the fire. And I knew I found the map so I could figure out which buildings burned and which direction the wind was blowing and how that would affect the lives of my characters. And suddenly I had a middle of my book.
That's wonderful. And that's it goes back to what you were saying before about, even the secondary sources that seem the most reliable, and they're totally great. They're wonderful, but history has a history too. Yes. History can be, the history books. I left them at school, but I brought in 3 history textbooks for my students to look at. One was from 1867. The next one was from 1889. The last one was from 1900. And they all share very similar qualities in just the layout, the way it's written, and it's very, it's basically like, if you read that, you'd think that like the only thing that's ever happened in American history is wars.
Yeah.
It's like, and then a bunch of, a war. And like that was like the direction of it. But it's like, that is a historic document of its own. And the lack of, it's just like a photographer. You have a lot of power over what people see based on what you take a picture of. So if you are writing history and there's a fire that patriots probably set, and your audience for the history is Americans in, I don't know, maybe like 1876, like 100 years later, the centennial, and you're like, I don't want to make these guys.
We're not going to go there.
We're going to go. They're heroes. Like, these guys are all great, and it's almost like the books of. I was just talking to students today about this with, and it makes it seem like I have like this incredible. I think I just go around annoying them with little factoids, but was it Robert? Kenneth Roberts, the author from he's
from Maine, right?
30s. Yeah, he's from Kennebunk, Maine. And he wrote a bunch of books in the 30s primarily, including Northwest Passage, about Robert Rogers. And he wrote, so a number of his books in that era were about people like Robert Rogers, these usually like loyalists, Tories, of course, Robert Rogers pre-Revolutionary War, so that was French and Indian War when everybody. But it was like that was, going against conventional wisdom, and maybe that says something about the 1930s that hey, look at this, we're in this Great Depression. Maybe everything that we've been living up to wasn't exactly great. And
exactly. You have a generation of Americans who were disappointed, who just came through that, those were terrible years.
Right.
And so were willing to do some interrogation that was overdue.
And they ended up using that story, and they made the movie out of it with Spencer Tracy, which is basically an hour and a half of pro World War II propaganda. It's like, and that's the project the kids were working on today, is they were taking movies from the 30s and showing how they were primary sources of the 30s. And the kid he did it on his own, but he found the right scene where you see Rogers Rangers on one side of the fort at Crown Point and British soldiers on the other side. And they're facing each other because they're on the same side. Right. And the commanders are walking. And I'm like, it's 1940 when this movie comes out. Right. Britain's at war. Alone. They really, really want, and there's plenty of elements in the United States who really would like us to do more than just sell them a bunch of, ships and stuff. What do you think? What side do you think this, So you can go and you can look at the history as well as the pop culture. You can look at it all, and it's just documents, so tell me a little bit more about that article that prompted this, because 1993, that's on the cusp of the information age. That's like right before the internet really takes off commercially anyway. And so, it seems like the work that you've done in writing, especially history, is kind of basically grown up with the internet, hasn't it?
Absolutely. In 1993, I didn't have the internet. It was a couple of years before we got our first dial-up. And even then, Gmail, email wasn't widespread yet. So here's the article that was in an old-fashioned newspaper, the newspaper that I used to work for at one point, the Philadelphia Inquirer. Here's a great artifact for your own history. And it's an article that discussed a museum exhibit in downtown Philadelphia, where I lived then, where I live now, about the 200th anniversary of this terrible epidemic. Yellow fever epidemic that killed thousands and thousands, digging mass graves, serious kind of. In Philadelphia that summer, they didn't know how yellow fever was spread. They didn't know how to cure it. Sounding a little bit like COVID. It's very scary times. I was drawn to it because I like gross medical things, but also because I was really, when I read this article, because I'm a big history nerd, I was like, why didn't I know about this when I was a kid? This is because Philadelphia was the capital of the United States then. We were a little tiny baby country in 1793. Washington was president, right? And Hamilton was in town, and Jefferson was being a pain in the neck to everybody. And they all left during the epidemic, right? So I was just so fascinated to read about early Federalist America, just these new days in this new country, and this terrible thing happens. And the thing about terrible things is that they bring out the best in some people and they bring out the worst in others. So there was nothing online, because online didn't really exist. So I had to go to my public library to look up where I could find historical documents, primary sources. In Philadelphia, we have the Historical Society of Pennsylvania downtown. And people in Philadelphia, they really dig history, Liberty Bell and all that. So everybody holds on to their grandmother's letters. So this place is a treasure trove. And I went down there. I would put my kids on the bus and I would grab the train and head downtown for months. And I was looking at things like this. Can you see that?
Yeah. That's
a photocopy from the historicals that, you can get them. You're not allowed to take a letter and put it on the Xerox machine. But this is one of the letters from John Welsh. And he was this kid who he wound up, I actually had to do some research for his life because I wanted to make sure he survived, and he did. But he was like a 17-year-old boy who worked in the equivalent of an early grocery store. And his boss, like most wealthy people, left town and said, John, you're staying here. I need you to mind the store. And I want you to write me a letter a day and tell me how things are going on. And so John would write him these incredible letters that would give the gossip and the rumors and the details. And then you have to imagine me, I'm in this archive, and I'm taking notes in my notebook because laptops hadn't been invented yet. Mm-hmm. So doing it, fourth grade style here. And I'm turning the page, and all of a sudden this man's handwriting, which is pretty nice, was a scrawl. And I was just gasped because I was so entranced by this man and this kid and all this bravery. He had gotten sick. He had come down with yellow fever, and strangers took him in and cared for him. And it was just, and I found so many different kinds of sources that told that story over and over about people who were disrespectful and not nice to others, and people who were really open-hearted. So that experience was my experience of learning the power of primary sources, which for me are not just documents. One of the most important ones I found was a map of Philadelphia from the time period. And for most of my historical books, I've found a map of the time in the right place. And I've been able to blow it up ginormous and then put all my different scenes and things on it. So I understand the geography of the place.
That it must be, and you're the only person that can really do this because it's your story, but it must be so incredible to be able to go into that world so deeply. It's like traveling time.
It truly is. It truly is. I love
it's so cool. And I love, and what you said about Philadelphia and everybody holding on to things. We could take Philadelphia as a primary source right now and say, this is really the city where the Enlightenment arrived in America. Thanks to Ben Franklin, because he goes to England, and he's like in London. He's like, oh my God, these people are like sharing their ideas with each other. They're open about having these conversations in coffee houses, and then he comes back to Philadelphia and he's like, I'm going to do this here, right? Yeah. And he starts applying all those. And like I said, it was the first capital. It was the place where the Declaration was written, where the Constitution was written. It has so much there. So of course I'm sure that radiates for most of the public there of hold on to your stuff, we are a historic place. Yeah.
And when you find things, people share them. But it's interesting, even and there's lots of great universities in Philly, and we have Valley Forge just down the road from Philadelphia. And I set a book there. But I was still able to find in my research for that book some things that have been they had their own archive at Valley Forge back then, and where people had donated stuff. And I was able to find a letter that was written from Valley Forge that had some details about some of the people who were held in slavery, who served the officers who were at Valley Forge. and the kind of detail that I've never been able to find anywhere else. So there's still, you think, wow, it's been almost 250 years. Everything's been explored. No, there's a lot still out there.
It's so great that you cover, especially with 1793, because especially back in strangely the 90s, but for a very long time, that whole era was kind of glossed over. You go from, in most history texts or just in, normal people's understanding of history, American history, they go from, Revolutionary War, Declaration of Independence. I think a lot of people have this idea that the Constitution was like the next day, not 11 years after the Declaration of Independence. And then there's like this vacuum. There's just nothing
until the Civil War.
Right. And even like you might get a little bit of peppering in of 18, it's like, oh, the new century and, Washington, the city's being created. But like that interim era, that early federal period, which is so important. I mean, I think a lot of historians actually say that the revolution was not complete until 1800. It wasn't until the election when the party changed, from Federalist to Democrat Republican, that the actual revolution was successful because they were able to change power peacefully. That was the key to their success that way. Because a lot of people, and I can be a stickler about this with my class. I'm like, look, the revolution, the Revolutionary War are not interchangeable terms. The revolution is the big period that you have a beginning, usually 1763, and then, with the end of the 7 Years' War. Right. And then the end would be 1800, 1801, when Jefferson takes office. And so it's like that's the revolution. The Revolutionary War was a major part of it, but it's within that era. It's like, it's the expression of the ideas put into action, I should say. And that's why it's like, imagine had this yellow fever gotten completely out of control and turned into a larger epidemic, spread to different cities and claimed the lives of the leaders of the new country. I mean, that would have, probably brought the country, pretty down pretty quickly,
My theory has always been if the British had been paying attention, and they were a little busy over there in Europe in 1793, and France was doing its thing. That's when they should have invaded then, and they would have taken us over again. Easily. Yeah. Philadelphia was so weak. We really didn't have the army's kind of a mess, and everyone's still trying to figure it out. One thing though I want to bring up, and that is the new book that I'm working on, which is set in Boston in 1776, because I'm so irritated that Johnny Tremain ends as the war is beginning, right? Johnny Tremain, by the way, written in the middle of World War II, also a great piece of anti-German propaganda. And when I started to research into the lives of the real people who were in Boston during the British occupation and then immediately after, and then I get curious about people like I did with John Welsh when I was researching fever. I wanted to find out who was he as an adult, right? He wound up being amazing. He wound up being an incredible businessman, had a huge family, great wife, and he endowed a chair at the University of Pennsylvania School of Business. This was the kid who minded the store during the pandemic. But in Boston, I was able to see how close the American Revolution was to the Civil War, because there were grandchildren of people who were in their teens and early 20s in Boston during the Revolution. Their grandchildren fought in the Civil War. Yeah, that's living memory. Right. That's like a heartbeat. And I think this happens too when you get older. It's really, really hard, I think, when you're young, because your brain's still growing and you don't really have this concept yet of time. But our country is so young. It is. I would argue, by the way, that revolution's not over yet. That we are, because my definition is that Declaration of Independence, which made this promise that we're all going to be treated equal, which has obviously been interpreted differently in different time periods. But the way I interpret it, we're still working on that promise.
This is the last EPS Podcast short episode of the second season, but it's certainly not the last one to be made. I'll be hosting Everything is a Primary Source Podcast live podcast karaoke this spring and summer, and I invite you to come on out and take part and help make short episodes yourself. Or, better yet, you can book a podcast karaoke event for your library, museum, school, store, restaurant, or other business by emailing me at epspodcasthost@gmail.com. EPS Podcast Live podcast karaoke goes well practically everywhere because, well, everything is a primary source.